Hello, my name is Prof. Peter Shepherd, and I'm going to be talking to you about whole brain thinking and learning and living. We live to learn, we learn to live. So what we'll be going through is a number of slides, which we've divided into 5 parts. I think you can see those for yourself, so I'll move straight into the first part. A very famous expression, I think, therefore. Now, the actual quote you may know is, I think, therefore I am. But this is a bit of a play on words, a joke. I think, therefore I tire easily. So it begs the question is, if we're thinking a lot, do we get tired? Does our brain get tired? I'll leave you to think about that. Another famous quotation is, as we think, so we become, by Benjamin Disraeli. So as we were talking about in part 1, the brain, but we also say, and personality. So where does personality fit in? Our personality is often defined by the number of traits we have. And there are many, many traits. Most have a genetic basis, but some more so than others. So for example, if you've got a very strong trait, let's say you're very, very talkative, then that probably has a more genetic basis. And you will be a talkative child, but you will grow up to also be a talkative adult. Now then there's intelligence, and we're going to look at this in much more detail a little later. But popularly, we often used to think of, when we say someone is intelligent, we're really just looking at their IQ or their intellectual intelligence. And that has about 70% genetic predisposition. Whereas the other popular one today, we call emotional intelligence or EQ. This is less strongly genetic, probably closer to the plus minus 50%. So this then can, of course, be strengthened. We say we can strengthen EQ perhaps up to 20, 30%. But IQ cannot be, or very little, very young in our life, but generally not very much at all. So these traits also can be fitted into our whole brain. In other words, we'll be looking at some traits tend to come more from preferences in our left hemisphere and others in our right hemisphere. The CPP, we've divided the traits into 6 clusters. I won't go into these in detail, but it is showing that if we look at the top 3, the blue, the brown, and the yellow, this is our what's called thinking brain, our cognitive self. And then if we look at the bottom 3, the green, the pink, and the red, this is our emotional self, our emotional brain. But then we've got our left hemisphere. So those left behavioral preferences showing up in the blue and the green, and the right showing up in the yellow and the red. So when we look at the whole brain model, we want to break it into what is called the split brain concept of the left and the right. Then we combine this with the triune brain, the evolutionary levels, cerebral, limbic, and reptilian. So we have our thinking self, our emotional self, our left and our right selves. So this whole area began with research done by someone who broke the brain into its 3 sort of evolutionary components. And they said the human brain actually is a combination of the reptilian brain, sometimes called the very ancient instinctive part of ourselves. This is the crocodile in us or the snake in us, the reptile, and it's instinctive. We generally find it difficult to control. Then we have the emotional brain, very powerful, which can be controlled, but can sometimes be very difficult to control, the limbic system. And then finally, the mass of our brain, about 80% of it, is our cerebral cortex, our thinking brain. So putting these three brains together, three in one, it became known as the triune brain. Now, looking then at it from this perspective, it helps us break it down. And so you can see the reptilian brain. I won't list all these out, but you can see breeding and grooming and even rhythm and so on. Self-defense, self-preservation, survival. So hence the instinct. Then we get the mammalian or the emotional or the limbic brain. And here it is interesting that people talk about power and politics. And actually, they are very much wrapped up into our emotional selves. The emotional brain also mediates between our conscious and our subconscious. And then, of course, there's the human brain, the cerebral, the thinking part, conceptualizing, reading, writing, logic, math, problem solving, and so on. Now, we mentioned already that the brain has been or is able to be talked about as being split. And a famous Nobel Prize winner, Roger Sperry, he got the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine, where he did experiments on epileptics, people who were severely epileptic, and there were no cure, no drugs for epilepsy in those days. This is back in the 70s. And so he found that when he surgically separated the two hemispheres, he could then isolate the areas of a fit and so on. So you may have an epileptical fit in the left, you separate that, then you can at least carry on being more normal in the right. Now, this is a popular one, and I often ask people, when you look at this two hemispheres of the brain, which side will you prefer to be in? Which side tends to seemingly be having more fun and laughter and games? Of course, that would be the right. So this is just an interesting way of looking at the left being very logical and linear and analytical, and the right, the more creative, artistic, visual, spatial, and so on. Another way also of looking at that, left and right, which you'll see in this diagram, it talks about there's a little bridge there, or actually two bridges. And so that's the linkage between the left and the right. That's something called the corpus callosum, and that's where Dr. Roger Sperry actually surgically severed that. Then there's a stop sign, like traffic lights. That means actually you can control the flow of information from left to right if you're conscious of it, if you're aware of it, or if you want to. And then there is a bridge between the left and the right limbic. So that's quite an interesting metaphorical picture, if you will. Another one also looks at just purely those two, the blue and the green, the very left, and then the yellow and the red, the very right. And the corpus callosum, which I mentioned, this is just showing a slice of the brain down through the middle. So you can see it's actually a bit like a web-based joining. So if it's like you take your hands and you spread the neuron connections out to the left and out to the right. Now, let's then try to address this question. Some people say, why are men different from women? Why are women different from men? So let's look at some gender differences and the brain. Here's another lateral slice of the brain. You'll see the corpus callosum there in the center, linking the two. And what we find there is, I'll just address your attention to the bottom left. The corpus callosum is actually some 10 to 12% more dense, larger, thicker in the female brain. In other words, there are more connective fibers. And that has implications for a greater connectivity between the two hemispheres. Also, when we look at the language cortex, we find that the male tends to prefer generally to use the left over the right, although some may prefer to use the right, but women are able to, or more easily able to use both sides. We'll look at a few more differences a little bit later, but that's just showing you schematically. So here, for example, we say in males, then visual spatial capacity is greater, more able to focus better generally with not simple maths, but higher maths. And however, more prone to violence because the emotional brain, the limbic system, pumps out various hormones. And the hormone of aggression is the male sex hormone, testosterone. We won't have time to go into all the different hormones. But in the female, as I mentioned, the language cortices are both more active. And women are able to multitask, generally speaking, better than men. Now, there's a big debate and controversy over this, because actually neuroscience shows that if you're multitasking, you're not doing any one single task as well or as thoroughly as maybe you should be doing. So there are actually advantages to being able to focus and, concentrate on one task at a time. Women generally are a bit better with detail, and interestingly enough, overall tend to be more reliable. And of course, then I think the mother instinct, the maternal instinct, perhaps a bit better nurturing and empathizing. And there are many, many other aspects. If we look at this also in learning, then we will find that men generally are less likely to ask or share, whereas women will tend to be the opposite. I won't go into these in detail. You can study them perhaps later. But there are therefore certain differences which are distinctly put in, on the one hand, in the anatomy of the brain being different. Secondly, the hormones being different. And therefore, of course, there is the behavioral and cultural tendencies to stereotype that men should do this or women should do that, and so on. So that's a little bit about gender. It's a big subject, and I'd be happy to go on that topic for hours and hours. But let's look at some personalities, some famous personalities and their preferences. Now, remember what we said is we've got all these particular cluster preferences, whether we're leaning more to the left or more to the right, or whether we're more a thinking, serious person or an emotional type person. So there's too many names for you to be able to read and recognize. Some famous ones are there. And what we'll do is we'll just select a few. So firstly, I think a well-known figure globally, I probably don't even have to mention his name. You will know immediately, Nelson Mandela. Now, Nelson Mandela was a rare leader in the sense that he had massive empathy. So the pink cluster of traits would be the strongest in him. Then the emotional expression, which is the red, and then finally the green, which is the detail. So he's balanced in that sense. Now, another person, or two people we have here, Confucius is on the left and Abraham Lincoln on the right. So they were different in the sense that their cluster preferences falls into the brown category, the balanced, cerebral thinking person. And then the yellow being the more creative and the blue being the logical. And so it's fairly rare that you will get people who are balanced in both of these. But it can make for a very interesting category of people. Then we have the famous Tiger Woods. So green is his preference because it's detailed, it's discipline. Then he's got the blue, the analytical, but he's also got, as all golf or a lot of sports people would need to have, a strong visual spatial capacity, so the yellow. Whereas Mahatma Gandhi, a visionary. So yellow is the visionary self, looking into the future. And then the spiritual, which will be the green, a revolutionary, if you like, red, and also, of course, very disciplined. And then two ladies. So Mother Teresa, humanitarian, spiritual, traditional, caring. Very strong with the red, and of course, also some pink, which you can't see there. And then Princess Diana, equally humanitarian, but very interpersonal, but also a little more visionary. So she has some of the yellow. And then we have Mozart, very yellow and very red, extremely right brain, a non-conformist, very musical, a musical genius, as we would say, a party animal, highly creative. And then Einstein, who you might remember, has a famous quotation that says, imagination is more important than knowledge. And so the yellow imaginative self, but equally, of course, he was very strongly blue, the analytical. The yellow is also the conceptual and the blue is the mathematical. So you see he's very strongly balanced, but in the cerebral thinking brain. Now, apart from personalities, we can also think of some icons that tend to represent our preferred color. When you've done the Credo personality profile and you've got your own profile, and then you discover whether you are more yellow or blue or pink and so on, you will also be able to refer to these types of icons. And so the clown is there, the jazz musician, very red, very emotionally expressive. And then we have the counselor or the nurse, very empathetic, the pink. And then we have what we call the sort of logical sequential person, following the clock, following sequence. And then, of course, science, the medical practitioner, and coming back to the top, the balance, the judge, if you will, the scales of justice. We're going to look at learning, but let's look at a famous quotation from someone called Tony Stockwell. To learn anything fast and effectively, you have to see it, hear it, and feel it. Of course, there are many quotations around that, and Confucius had a famous one as well. So there's the concept, that I see it, okay, I believe it, I hear it, but until I really feel it, I won't do it. So here now, let's look at learning and intelligence, or the concept of multiple intelligences. Dr. Howard Gardner, a famous educationist from Harvard, developed this idea that we are not just having one intelligence. We would talk about someone being very intelligent. We have many intelligences. And so he divided them into 8 particular areas, which you'll see in this slide. So he talks about a person who's verbally, linguistically able to use language and words, and might be typically, we'll just say, word smart. And then there is the person who's very good with numbers and logic. This will be, in our personality sense, it will be the blue segment, but logic smart. And then he even discovered that people seem just naturally very good with nature. Sometimes we talk about people having green fingers, but people who are good with animals and the outdoors and so on. So naturalistic intelligence. So then we come to the people who are body smart. Sometimes this is called bodily kinesthetic intelligence. Gymnasts, sports people, the dancers even would be examples of people who are very agile and very able to use their body very well. Then we come to music smart, the musical genius. We were talking about Mozart before. So some people just have that musical talent. And a lot of these are actually talents. So when we talk about these areas of smartness or areas of intelligence, they are also areas of talent. And then we come to the people arena, the interpersonal. So people smart and people who interact well with others and seem to be able to communicate and relate very well and so on. And then finally, the intrapersonal, that's where you're looking more inside yourself, introspective, knowing yourself very well. So these were the 8 intelligences that Howard Gardner put forward. And also we can think of every intelligence has a range of talents, or putting it a better way, every talent is an intelligence. And all of these will have a very strong genetic component. So when we talk about learning and using as many intelligences as we can, we're actually using many parts of the brain. And so we get into something called learning styles. So let's say, for example, someone who's very yellow, their learning style is more likely to be very visual, and they are naturally very curious. They will probably ask lots of questions, and they'll also tend to sort of like learn by doing, by jumping in, if you will, adventurous, risk-taking. And then you have the red learning style. This would be the person who's the interpersonal, likes to learn with people. In fact, sometimes finds it difficult to learn on their own. They need to interact, they need to talk, they need to discuss, and so on. So I won't go into each one in detail, but the green one, for example, would be someone who needs everything mapped out logically, sequentially, step by step. If you jump all over the place, they can't follow. And then the blue, they're always looking for evidence, for facts, for proof. So whenever you put forward anything, they're going to question it. What is, the facts behind this, and so on. So we have these different, some people call them learning style. I prefer to call them a learning style preference. It's a preference that if given the choice, or when given the choice, you will use this particular part of the brain and these particular traits to learn better and more. Also, when we look at learning styles, there's another dimension to this. There are those people who are like moving, touching, very kinesthetic. One term often used is haptic. And a very big study, a major study done among 5,300 students around ages 11 to 18, looked at how their style preferences were. And the haptic, the moving, the touching, the doing was actually the highest, followed by auditory, listening becoming very important, and then the visual element, learning through pictures, symbols, color, objects. So that brings us then to the last part, and scene 2, part 5, where it all boils down to, if we've learned effectively, the test will be in the memory, won't it? If I can't recall, I haven't learned. So let's look at a bit of memory and the brain. So again, we can find different types of memory or different things that people remember better than others. Some people are very good at words, numbers. They can remember formulas and sequence, so very much the left. Whereas on the right, you got more the abstract patterns, shapes, relationships. Different areas of memory. They will remember more from seeing a picture, for example, rather than a numerical equation. So again, these are all emanating from parts of our brain. In actual fact, we say, if we know something already, we will tend to use something called our prefrontal cortex. That is the thinking brain. But if we don't know something, if something is new to us, it goes actually straight into our emotional brain, our limbic system, process it first. And actually a little piece of that system called the hippocampus, very central to memory, but especially processing new memories, okay? So what we want to look at is, how do we improve learning and memory? So if we can appeal to learning style preferences, remembering people will be different. And so if you're involved in trying to teach or train or develop a group of people, we must realize they're each are different, unique personalities that will process information differently from each other. Then the more senses we use, what we call the more intelligences, if you like, the whole brain concept, multisensory. For example, I often will give tests. And if I say, how many news items can you remember from the last 24 hours of reading a newspaper or listening to the radio or looking at TV? And then I'll ask another set of questions. How much can you remember of all the food and the drink that you consumed in the last 24 hours? Now, by far and large, everybody can remember much, much more of the food and the drink because they're using more senses. Whereas if I'm just listening to the radio, I'm only using one sense. If I'm looking at the TV, well, maybe I'm just using two. And so more senses we use, the better we will retain information. Of course, sleep then becomes very important, and a lot of recent research has now been done on showing that memories are actually processed in our sleep, and dream sleep being very important. We'll touch on that on the next slide. But also, how do we feel about ourselves, our self-esteem? Are we full of self-doubt? Are we negative and feeling, oh, this is too difficult, I won't be able to learn it? Then, of course, that is going to hold us back. But then even the environment where we learn. Some people, when studying, remember perhaps as a kid you were told to sit upright, sit under a bright light to do your homework. But they found that actually that's not the case for everybody. Some people can recline and process information better. Some can do it with some background music. And some students even like to be able to munch on food and so on. And when they're doing that, their brain is relaxed, the stress has gone away, and they can also learn. So what we might also add in here is stress kills learning. So we need to be more relaxed. And then there are many, many memory enhancement techniques, of course, and ultimately we say, well, learning should be fun. Now, how do we improve our memory? Many classic techniques, and there's a few we just quickly list here. So the multisensory again, the hear, the see, the touch, the move, the taste, the smell. Repetition and rehearsal. Sometimes we say, remember to repeat and repeat to remember. I already mentioned stress, having a lower level of stress, because stress kills certain chemicals that are needed for processing information in the brain. Techniques like mnemonics, rhyming, acronym, melody, song, music. Mind mapping is another technique. But of course, we need very strong personal interest. We need to be interested in the topic that we're learning. So our motivation is very important. And then using all those multiple intelligences and matching our own preferred learning style. So these are all techniques to help us improve our memory. I touched on sleep. This is a bit detailed, but the idea is that we go through these cycles of brain waves. So when we're alert, awake, conscious, we're in our what's called beta mode, 13 to 30 cycles per second. But as we daydream, as we drift off, we haven't yet fully gone to sleep, we're in the alpha mode, light alpha. Sometimes they call it the twilight zone. And then we move into a deeper alpha and finally into a theta. And when we're in the theta, where we're dreaming, where we have what's called Rem sleep, Rem stands for rapid eye movement, then this is where the memories are being processed and sorted out, if you will, during our dreams. And so the people, they've done studies that deprived of dream sleep, their memory plays havoc. They won't do well. They've done a lot of studies to show that you have really good 7 or preferably 8 hours sleep, then you do your study, you'll do much better than if you've had only a couple of hours of sleep, staying up late, swatting or something like that. And so they've found it's very, very important. And then, of course, we go through these cycles approximately every 90 minutes. So the idea is you can quickly divide. If you only have, say, 5 hours of sleep, you're only going to have about 4 cycles, 3 and a bit to 4. But if you have 8 hours of sleep, you're going to have so many more. You're going to have at least 6 cycles. So the more cycles you have, the better it will be for your memory. Now, I've touched, I think, enough on this. It is also showing that the connectivities are taking place in our brain during the sleep, and particularly the rapid eye movement. So I've already mentioned that. So the more cycles you can have, the better. And this was a study done by Harvard Medical School that they were trying to teach people what you would call speed and accuracy, keyboard skills, if you will. And what they found is after sleep, the areas in yellow, it's a bit hard to pick up, showed more activity, speed, and accuracy in the skills themselves. And if we looked at these, we broke them down in something called the right medial prefrontal cortex. Okay, the activity was very, very strong and high there. And then another piece in the right hippocampus. Now, remember I mentioned before, if we're using a prefrontal cortex, it's usually we're processing information based on something we know. We're building on something we know. But if something is thrown at us is we know nothing about, brand new, then we're using the hippocampus. So this is showing where that brain part lights up. And then also the primary motor cortex, where perhaps we're learning movement. And so when we're learning movement, we're using what's called the motor cortex. So each part of the brain has different functions, and therefore we need, if we understand that, we can relate the learning to that particular function. Now, this is quite complex. It really is neuroscience and learning where they've come together, and now there are wonderful new breakthroughs in understanding the brain. But importantly, of course, we won't learn and we won't remember unless we concentrate. So I was talking before about the learning environment, and they've actually found that if you're reclining at about 45-degree angle, your brain is more easily going to process information than if you're sitting upright and maybe not so comfortably. Then temperature needs different. Some people like a warm temperature, some like a colder. Lighting, some people like bright light, some like more diffused, softer light. Some like music, some like silence. And we're also talking about some like to nibble and munch as they learn. So I usually use an activity, but I won't do this here. If we're having a long lecture, I would ask you, if you've already been sitting still and listening for more than half an hour, you should stop, have some exercise, get up, walk around, and so on. Do some exercises that laterally connect the two sides of the brain. And there's a lot of very simple ones. But if you just sort of take your left hand and pull the right lobe of your ear, and then you take your right hand and pull the left lobe, you're already now using something called a cross-lateral brain stimulation, exercising both halves of the brain and bringing them together. Now, again, very important is, we can say our interest, yes, motivation and passion, but on top of that, it doesn't matter how motivated you are, how passionate you are, if you're not getting enough oxygen, not breathing properly, then that's going to affect your brain as well. The brain thrives on glucose. Glucose comes in many forms, of course, what we call the brain sugars, if you will, fructose and sucrose and so on. But it comes via blood. If our circulation is not good, if we're not getting good blood flow into the brain, then the brain is not going to be processing information efficiently. And so for students, often we use this sort of checklist, but this can be adult students as well. I'm not talking about necessarily school students. You could be a mature student doing your MBA or even a DBA, right? And these have found to be very important. Having a choice, having adequate time, having that enriched environment. Collaborative learning is also very important. And eventually, of course, attaining some level of mastery and then being able to apply what you've learned. Now, I've covered the brain waves. I think I won't go into this, but this is just showing the breakdown, and it links to the sleep cycles that we were talking about before. Now, I mentioned music, and studies have been done to show that the ideal type of music should not have any familiar melody. Because once I hear something that's familiar, it's going to detract, isn't it? My mind is going to go off on that memory. It's not going to be focusing on what I'm listening to or studying or reading. It should not have too strong a rhythm. And ideally, we shouldn't be able to predict when a piece of music is going to start or finish. It should have no apparent beginning, middle, or end. And again, ideally, no familiar instruments. Because if I happen to have a familiar instrument or an instrument I love, if I happen to, play the trumpet or the guitar, I'll be listening out for that. So that these are detracting us from focusing. So therefore, actually, music composed and played on a synthesizer is ideal and played at the resting heart rate of about 60 beats per minute. Now, I already mentioned exercise. So again, the body needing a good supply of oxygen, glucose, blood flow, and so on. So we should be taking our activity breaks periodically during our learning and energizing both sides of our brain. And here's just a quick schematic diagram, which you can see that, of course, we take in air, comes into the lungs. We take in food, goes into the stomach. But eventually all goes into the blood, and then the heart pumps it into the brain. And so again, even if we've got arterial sclerosis, if we've got thickening of the arteries, the blood flow is also going to be broken down. And we have these two what are called carotid arteries that are the main lines out of the heart into the brain. So these should be, we'll say, very healthy. And so we need to be careful what we eat, but exercise also helping a lot. Now there are, when I said food, sometimes there's this lovely expression, we are what we eat, or I sometimes say we become what we eat. But there are certain foods that have been found to be good for the brain, for alertness, and therefore for learning. And these are listed on the left there. And then there are others that can lower our stress level, relaxants, if you will, or even helping us go to sleep. So we have a good night's sleep. All of these will be very important. And most medical practitioners will tell you what's good for the heart actually is also good for the brain. Now, I've talked a bit about neuroscience, but we need also to realize that we've got this emotional brain. We process a lot of information in it, and it only then gets shunted up to the prefrontal cortex and the judgmental brain. So these neural systems of intellect and emotion, while they're separate, they are interconnected. They integrate thoughts and feelings. And that's why much earlier we're saying, if learning can be fun, then it's enhancing the emotional or emotionality. And if you think back of any memories you have that are very strong from years gone by, there's usually always an emotional connection. And so we should not separate emotions from the intellectual thinking, cognitive learning. This is just showing a picture of a neurotransmitter and synapses. And again, the neurons in the brain and how they interconnect and so on. And if we got a healthy brain, means we got healthy neurons and healthy environment around the neurons. Again, this is the complexity of the network. But we can also find that sometimes when we eat the wrong foods, they form what are called plaques in the brain, and they can eventually clog up the brain. And so I think a lot of today people are worried about aging diseases like dementia, like Alzheimer's, which come from too much junk food, processed food, and so on. But we don't have time to go into nutrition much more. So there's our prefrontal cortex, and we've got the amygdala, and very close to that, that's the limbic system, is also the amygdala. And this is just another quick brain scan, which might be good for some of you to realize that when I am learning something new and perhaps difficult, greater neural activity takes place in the brain. But when I've already got mastery, when I know it or know most of it, and I can do it easily, sometimes we say I can do it without thinking, then lesser effort is required by the brain. So it's actually, if we talk about when we open up, do I learn a lot and think a lot and therefore get tired? It's the brain that when I'm learning and thinking new, difficult, complex things, yes, more energy will be consumed. Whereas if I'm doing something where I've got mastery and I can do it without thinking, then I can actually go on much, much longer doing it. So you think of some of those great tennis players where the match goes on for 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours, maybe 3 hours, but they're exercising mastery. And finally, I'm often asked questions about Albert Einstein. And so some people say if we have a big brain, maybe we're more intelligent or more smart or more clever, or we're going to learn better. But no, it's not the size of the brain, it's how the brain functions inside. And Einstein's brain, in actual fact, was smaller than the average, about 2.7 pounds versus 3.1. But what they found was the cerebral cortex was thinner and had greater neural density. So with what's called a decreased conduction time. Now, this is a bit complex, but what it means is that information can pass faster between various parts of the brain. Also, his inferior parietal lobes were much larger and enhanced, and so he was able to think using visual spatial capacity and visual imagery. So that's why he often visualized the solution to a problem before he actually sat down with pencil and paper or chalk and mapped out it in a numerical way. But they also said that he was able to intuit numerically, which is pretty rare quality. And the other thing is that each brain hemisphere was a little wider with larger expanse of integrated cortex. The left hemisphere actually also contained 73% more glial cells per neuron. Now, I haven't gone into glial cells, but these are cells that help feed and nurture the neurons. So what we're saying here is that if you have more of these, which Einstein was found to have, that would help him be able to think and to reason and to work things out so much faster and better than the average human being. So I just thought I'd finish with that. Now, this has been quite a long session, and my question might be to you whether you are enthused, better informed, perhaps enriched, but you might also be tired, especially if a lot of this information was new to you. Yes, you still could be quite confused or dazed, but I think importantly, if you're curious, if you're intrigued, if you're motivated, then you'll go on to want to learn more about the brain, learning, memory, living, and thinking. It's a mix of emotions that actually will determine our future behavior. So what do you do next? I hope it is positive. Thank you for listening. Before I end, in case you want to know a little bit more about my background, I'm showing here my academic qualifications, the research I've done on personality, thinking, learning, and the early studies, some professional awards and so on. And so it is just a little bit about me and current activities that I pursue, of course, facilitating learning, but as a researcher, author, I've written several books, and consultant, coach, lecturer, trainer, and so on. So I think this helps you see a little bit about my background. And I have lived and worked in many different countries and cultures, and spent over 35 years as a consultant and a trainer in various areas like organization development and human resource development and so on. But I do have a corporate background. I was 5 years with an international airline, 5 years with a large US multinational pharmaceutical company, and studying all my early studies done in New Zealand Government Department of Agriculture. And that's where I first studied genetics, which I mentioned earlier. So that's just a bit about my background. And once again, please be in contact with us. And I hope that you are motivated enough to get the Credo personality profile done for yourself or for your team, if you like, or for your employees. Thanks once again.